one another intimately. So we're going to have to keep feeling our way along.
I think one of the interesting things I would like to try to do a little stage setting, because this all happened between 1778 and 1781, and it was extraordinary. And I think what I'd like to do is give you an idea of just exactly how extraordinary it was. We have difficulty, George and I both, in trying to get accurate figures. How many people were on the east side, how many people were on the west side. And it's very difficult to do that. We have some hints. We do know that at the time of the Revolution, there were 2,160 plus or minus people in the town, the one unit. And the first thing that strikes you is, of those, 1 out of every 5 human beings was in military service of one sort or another. They were 2 months men, or 3 months men, or 9 months men, or 3 years men, or whatever. But it was extraordinary. The second thing you have to realize is that at the time this debate took place, things were not going well for the American cause. And I'll illustrate that if you let me shuffle for a moment.
While John is shuffling, I want to point out that the foundation of much of what you'll hear today is contained in a book which John compiled about 20 years ago called The War Years. It's a paperback, and there are copies available at Barely Read Books. Quite inexpensive, but it's a marvelous compilation of all the town meetings from 1765 to 1881. And not only is it the verbatim reduction of those meetings, but John has added little sidebars of what's happening in the Revolution at that time. Battle of Saratoga, Stamp Act is repealed, so that you get a feeling of the context of the times in which Sudbury was struggling with all of the problems which they faced in those years. And it doesn't take long to read 4 or 5 town meetings, and the town meeting gives you the feeling of what's going on in the community, what are the types of issues that are involved. And they're not all Revolutionary War issues, although they tend to dominate. So how are you doing?
Well, starting with 78, on May 5th, Washington announced that France was in support of the American cause. And things looked up a little bit. On June 28th of that year, General Cornwallis was defeated by Washington at Monmouth and ran away to fight another day. The war was not a long way off. The British fleet caught the French fleet just off Boston and destroyed it. And on November 3rd of that year, 9 regiments of Minute Militia were ordered to Boston to keep the British from landing. That's only 20 miles from here, folks. In the following year, the British destroyed the Massachusetts Navy. The American attack on Savannah failed with heavy casualties. The following year, 1780, in January, Cornwallis landed 8,000 troops at Savannah. And on May 12th, the American General Lincoln surrendered his entire army to General Clinton at Charlestown, South Carolina. So things were not going well at all. Now remember, you've got these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, 450 plus citizens of this town actually serving in the military. The costs of that service were enormous, absolutely enormous. There was the cost of paying the soldiers, the cost of equipping the soldiers, the cost of taking care of the soldiers' wives, the cost of taking care of other levies being made upon the town by the state for their duties. Now, to give you a comparative figure, in one year, 1779, the year before, the budget for running the normal town budget was something in the neighborhood of $600 to $800. The levy for military alone in that year, in the following year, was £6,630. On top of that, the money collapsed. You heard it's not worth a Continental. Well, that's it. But they were being taxed in hard money, and they were being paid in soft money. There was a depression. One of the things and the town meeting is dealing with all of these. There was a huge problem with trying to control prices and labor costs. And they actually sat in town meeting and said the most you can charge for the best dinner in town is 12 cents. Very serious, with very serious penalties if you don't do it. Now, all the men also are away. So who's running the farms? The wives and kids are running the farms. The neighbors are trying to help run the farms. It was a horrible, horrible time, economically, politically, militarily, and it certainly was not a time that they wanted to see this question come up, but they love to have questions come up.
You can be sure that however, that the first article in almost every town meeting was paying the minister. 5 ministers sitting here this afternoon. They took care of the minister. Number one. When John was mentioning the loss of manpower to the military, and I believe Sudbury sent more men, maybe numerically, than any other town in Massachusetts at some time during the Revolutionary War. And you had the additional problem of having to find new officials. At every town meeting, they had to find somebody to be an assessor, somebody to be a field writer, somebody to be something else, because the men, as they put it, were away. And furthermore, there were the levies on the community for 2 particular commodities that Sudbury produced a lot of: hay and beef. These were mostly cattle farmers in the town, and we had wonderful hay resources, as you know, from the early settlement days. But the Continental Army, which was always mentioned in the Sudbury records as taking to Cambridge, not to Boston, but taking to Cambridge, so many tons of hay, so many barrels of beef, and there were really substantial numbers. So that the town officials had to make sure whose farm was going to provide this hay, this beef, who was going to cart it to Boston, and then the budget would come up to 20, 30, 40 payments made to various people within the town that had carried out those trips.
may be interested to know that also along with the bill of fare at town meeting during this small 3-year period, they had a few other things to do. Believe it or not, the town meeting had to determine what they were going to do about accepting the Articles of Confederation. And they voted without a dissenting vote to accept it and to instruct their representatives to the General Court to advise the Congress accordingly. On top of that, another one that took a great deal of time was they had to pass on the new Massachusetts Constitution. John Adams' handiwork. And they took it article by article up on the floor of the town meeting. They voted them up or they voted them down. But they had to send committees to Cambridge. Now all of this is going on top of the rest of this nightmare. You may be interested to know that they approved everything in the Massachusetts Constitution except for 2 items. And I personally just love these. The first one was a provision of the proposed Constitution said that the travel and salaries of all state representatives should be paid out of the public treasury, not on your life. That amendment was thunderously passed by the Sudbury town meeting. And the second one was a requirement that the governor, the lieutenant governor, the major officers in both civil and military had to belong to the Christian religion. Nope. That word Protestant had to be in there somewhere. Mr. Adams had to overcome that problem when he finally wrote the Declaration of Rights of the Massachusetts Constitution that eliminated that necessity. But I thought it was sort of typical Sudbury that they'd come up with those 2 things. But it tells you something about the times.
Well, it was really a thrill to find the word Constitution, only for several pages I thought they were talking about the U.S. Constitution. But they were actually concerned with formulating the Massachusetts Constitution, which I understand a great deal of it was incorporated later when the federal Constitution was written.
The oldest written Constitution in this world.
And I might just interject that this is living history. You are looking at the documents written by the men and women who produced these ideas. And,
now, when it comes to this question about East Side, West Side, not to be confused with the Irving Berlin song.
Shall we sing?
You may be interested to know that there's a little background on this, which sort of tells you something. In 1706, again in 1707, the people on the west side petitioned to have a separate parish from the east side. Now, a parish was a territorial denomination that applied to the application of church functions. But it was almost like a mini town, but they wanted 2 precincts within the town instead of 1. And a very, very familiar reason focused. They said, with the river of flood in winter, we are forced to seek our spiritual good with the peril of our lives. A little later on, they said, and this is the west side speaking, there being 365 on this side that cannot possibly go to meeting. Another thing to remember just at that point is that while this is going on, the numbers are changing. the west side is becoming more numerous than the east side. There are several hints about it that about all we can get. There's a marvelous map, 1708, that shows there were 43 houses on the east side and 54 on the west. You look at the minute company rolls, and there's an East Company, an East Minute Company, an East Militia Company, the same on the west. A handful of more people on the west side in that, but there's a couple of raw cards. There's a South Minute Company, which essentially was Framingham, the area of Framingham border. And that was, well, it had people from both sides, most of them were from the west side, and a North Minute Company that had people from both sides in it, and because of the location of the river, most of those came out of the west. You can see this changing. But the other episode that took place was in 1739 or 40. And at that point, oh, incidentally, they were granted their separate parish. And in 1722, the Reverend, I guess Israel Loring, came over here.
You stole them.
And by order of the town, he brought with him the brand new Bible, King James Bible, that this church still owns. But anyway, that happened without difficulty. It was opposed. Oh, I was talking about the second one that happened. 1739 to 40, the west side joined in a petition to the Great and General Court with the support of Framingham, Marlborough, and Stowe to have a separate town made out of the west side. Now that's kind of interesting. The opponents from the east side said, wait a minute, we already agreed to your precinct for the parish. We've gone to great expense in building 2 meeting houses, settling 2 ministers, and the amount of money we spend trying to keep that blamed causeway open so you could go back and forth is just killing us. Then they came up with, I thought, one of the most intriguing. I'm a lawyer. I love intriguing arguments. This one was unbelievable. To create 2 towns would violate the principles of the royal charter that had been given by James I. Because all lands, hereditaments, and all other estates given or by other lawful right or title whatsoever shall be by such towns their respective heirs, successors, assigns forever hereafter held and enjoyed according to the important patent of such respective grant. The theory being that if you split this up, you are undermining the royal grant itself upon which it lasts. I love that. Let's see.
Those words, assigns. What is an assign? The lawyer always seems to have 4 or 5 terms that confuse the issue. I want to just mention, go back to the 1708 request for a second parish. The petition to the General Court contained a map. It was a very primitive map, but it was nevertheless a map. And the purpose of the map was to persuade the General Court, of course, to provide for the second parish. But each household was indicated on the map with an H, 1708 shaped H. And the meeting house was scrawled on it and 2 or 3 other things. But items of Wayland Sudbury history that gets very little publicity. It's in the Massachusetts archives, and I think many of you have probably seen it. It's called the Brigham map. But it's fascinating because John's brought several maps here today to deal with more recent Sudbury history, but that one was particularly good. And it took from 1708 until almost 20 years later, for the predecessor of this building to be built, because they went back and forth from town meeting to town meeting, couldn't decide, sent petitions to the general court. So it was one of those typical east side, west side arguments which should have said to us that bigger things are coming ahead.
Well, we've set the stage. Now we want to introduce you as best we can to the central characters on this stage. From the west side, fortunately, is a fellow we know a great deal about. It was a man named Captain Aschel Wheeler. Now, Mr. Wheeler was a man of vast experience. To begin with, his family had come over from Concord, and they'd come to Concord from Wales. So he had a rather tenacious Welsh background. He had a large and extensive family. He was a military man. And when I say he was no sunshine soldier, he was with Arnold at Quebec. He was in the expedition to Ticonderoga. He was at Hull at Fort Independence. He was, at the same time, the man in town who was in charge of raising and assessing all the money to pay for the troops, the money necessary to pay for the care of their families. He was captain of an 80-man minute company, which was frequently called out. He had just an extraordinary background. In addition to the military things, he did 3 months at Saratoga. He was, of course, on the committees which you'll hear about to discuss the division of the town. He was one of the committee to draft the response to the Articles of Confederation. He was many times selectman, many times moderator. This is an experienced old hand at the game of politics and the game of life. And in view of the fact that the people on the east side, it turned out, wanted to grab his and his brother's farm, he was not pleased. And he came roaring back, as we shall see.
Well, the first town meeting, which discussed the separation of the east side from the west side, was held in May, I think, June 1778, and it was held in the East Meeting House. By that time, there was an agreement between the two sides that they would alternate meeting houses for town meetings, and east side, west side. And that probably made a considerable difference, because even though there were now two meeting houses, there were long distances to go, particularly, let's say, when you had to go to the East Meeting House, which by that time was in downtown Wayland, from the Wayside Inn, you could visualize that. Or contrarily, when the town meeting was held in this building, if you lived at the corner of Rice Road and Oak Street in Cochituate, you could visualize how far you had to come. So there were enormous differences in where the meeting was held might reveal who was going to have the voting power at that meeting. The article to separate the two towns was presented by a man named John Tilton. When I read in Helen Emery's book that she could find very little out about John Tilton, I thought, well, that means there isn't any information about John Tilton. Because you know that Helen would have dug it out. And we do know he was an East Sider, and it may very well be that he was chosen because he was not a Captain Wheeler, a person who was known, had opinions, had experience. He was just sort of Mr. East Side everybody. And he presented this question. It turned out in Article 2. And the next thing it says in the town report for that meeting was passed in the affirmative. So what's the problem? Well, immediately after that vote, the town meeting passed a second motion to appoint a committee. I think it was 6 men, 3 from each side of the river, to agree on a division line. And the meeting was adjourned temporarily. But about 2 weeks later, on July 6th, the adjourned town meeting met again and heard from the committee, and the committee reported that they can't agree on a satisfactory boundary line between the two halves of the town.
It's interesting to note that the members of that committee have names that are very familiar to your Sudbury history. Colonel Ezekiel Howe, where have you heard of him? Captain Richard Hurd, Nathan Loring, Phineas Gleason, John Maynard, John Marion. That was a pretty stark-packed committee. It was a good committee. But the committee could not agree. And they tried it again. And the committee could not agree. And then they did something in the records which drives me crazy. It said, then they voted to reconsider the vote for dividing the town. But they never told you what they did. Did they reject it? Did they approve it? We don't know. There's nothing there. If we could go back and instruct some ancient town clerk.
I think we really have to hand it to those town clerks, though, and the fact that somebody preserved those records and they're available to us, most remarkable kinds of documents. We brought in 2 or 3 copies of such documents that have been dredged out, but all in all, there are very few instances in which you don't find out what went on. So what are you getting up to?
Well, February 1 is the next meeting. Surprise, this one's on the west side. To see if the town will vote for a division of said town and agree upon a line of division so that we may be incorporated into 2 distinct towns. Well, they appointed another committee.
And the reports, committee cannot agree.
But they did vote, now this is interesting, that the town be divided by the river running through the same. And the island called Pelham Farm, now property of Richard Hurd, be annexed to the east side of the river. The land on the east side of said river to be set off from the town of Sudbury. And after a long debate, the question was put whether the town would add any more to the east side of the river, and it passed in the negative. Now, what's interesting to me, and I'm sure to you, is that's the first thought anybody would have looking at the relative position of these 2 towns on the internal problem of the river. For heaven's sakes, it's an old rule in land selling. If you're going to use a boundary, use a physical boundary. It's the easiest way to go. Don't give us this pail full of buckshot holes hung on a tree, you know, kind of stuff. Use the physical boundary. And so they did, first off, and apparently have some agreement on it, that made an exception in there for the Pelham herd situation. And I'm puzzled about that, and I just offer you the suggestion that if you look back, you'll find that the Pelham herd land was actually given by a separate grant in the beginning. And that's probably why they didn't have any trouble with it, because it was not a grant that had been made by the town. It had been a grant that had come from elsewhere, although it was in the town.
There was a grant that was made to an English investor who had performed services for the Massachusetts Bay Colony when it was still a corporation. And his name was Herbert Pelham. And for at least 200 years, what we now call Herd's Pond in Wayland was called Pelham Pond. And the only thing that remains of that entire issue is Pelham Island Road, because the east side people considered it to be an island because they had to go across a body of water to get to it, and that's what islands are. And the name Pelham Island has stuck to it, fortunately. But the Herd family who took over all of that property and dominated it for a long, long time were definitely east side folk. And the Wayland records are filled with herds. And by the time of 1780, the family focus on many, many families, which had been on both sides of the river for quite a long time in the early period, began to crystallize so that you had Puffers on this side and Rudders on this side and Herds on that side and Haynes on this side. So it helps a lot when you see names and you're trying to feel out where they are geographically. Where did this family live? Well, you know at least they were east siders or west siders. But that was really herd country.
That's an east side. 29th of March.
I love that little bit about the farm. That turned out not to be an issue. The fact that that was actually physically on the west side of the river, but was it seemed not to be an issue in the town meeting. Okay, give it to the herds.
Back on the east side, 29 March 1779. Article 10, to hear the report of their committee appointed at the last town meeting to agree on a line dividing the town of Sudbury and transact any matter or thing relative to the division of the same.
You know what it was actually? The first vote was not whether to pass or not pass the article. It was a vote to take Article 10 first. How many of you have been to a town meeting where some power group wants to get their article first and go home? But let's take up Article 27. Well, fortunately on March 29th, the sensible town meeting voted no. They wouldn't take up Article 10, and when it finally did come up, they turned it down.
Interspersed with the fact that after they got through the first part of it, the committee, again, this is again another committee, they didn't agree. So it was passed on in the negative, as they love to put it. Well, about this time, I gather that Asheville Wheeler had about enough. So from this point on, you will find all of the town meetings happening on the west side of the river. Point number one. Point number two. 20 September. And guess who's the moderator? Asheville Wheeler. To see if the town will choose a committee to attend the general court to hear the report of the committee appointed by the general court on the petition of the number of inhabitants of this town living on the east side of the Sudbury River. Give their committee so chosen such instructions relative to a division of said town that the town may think proper when agreeable to the petition of Elisha Wheeler and others. Now, apparently what had happened was, this is the first time we hear that the general court had sent this to a committee for a hearing. And apparently that was a fast one that the guys on the east side had managed to do. Well, when you've got a fellow like Wheeler, he knows all about politics. And what happened was very, very interesting. Formed another committee to attend the general court to hear the report of the committee appointed by the general court on the petition of a number of inhabitants of the town living on the east side of Sudbury River. Pretty good committee. Thomas Plimpton from here, Colonel Ezekiel Howe
Here.
and William Rice.
I'm not sure about William.
William Rice had voted, and the following instructions. Some debate about these instructions. But notwithstanding a former vote of this town for dividing the same by the river, yet upon more maturely considering the situation and viewing the circumstances, we are fully of opinion that a division of the same cannot take place without prejudice to one part or the other. You are therefore directed to use your utmost endeavors to prevent any division of the town. And on 6 December comes the capper to see if the town will choose a committee to act on behalf of this town at the great general court to oppose a division of the town, to give the committee so chosen such instructions relating to said affair as the town may think proper, and grant a sum of money to enable said committee to carry on said business or do or act according to a division of said town as the town shall think proper when met. Howe, Rice, and Plimpton are the group. They voted them the sum of £300 to begin with. And the directions are fantastic. You are hereby directed, authorized, and instructed to prefer a petition or memorial to the general court on behalf of the town, praying that the bill for dividing said town may be set afire or altered, setting forth the great disadvantages the westerly part of the town will labor under by a division of said town as reported by said committee. That is to say, such report deprives them of all gravel and obliges them to maintain the one half of the great causeway on the easterly part of the town, notwithstanding the necessary repairs on the highways on the westerly part of the town are near double to that on the east. Said report also deprives them of the pound. It deprives them of a training field given to them by the proprietors of said town to the westerly side as a training field forever. And further, if there is no provision made in said report for the support of the poor in said town, which will be a very heavy burden to the west side of the town, as the report now stands. And then they voted them another £300. Now, this is almost the total town budget in a normal year. This is a committee of the general court meeting in Boston, and these guys are given a £600 slush fund to go in there and do a little, what do they like to call it, lobbying. Documents I would love to have is an accounting for the £600, but it's an absolutely extraordinary move, and it leaves you breathless. What next?
Well, that's one of the wonderful things about John's summary of the war years, because you can read that entire petition, not just a summary of it, you can read it all. And particularly the misspellings. I like those best of all, and the use of arcane words which we began centuries ago. The entire thing is laid out in front of you. But buried in there, you have just heard a couple of words that evidently have been simmering in the background. One of them is gravel, and the other one is pound. Well, the talk in the taverns, which were discussing these separation, must have been a lot more forthwith in detailing what the issues really were. Well, the gravel refers to that enormous pile of sand that we have been calling Sand Hill for several centuries. And where Old County Road leaves Route 20, winds up and over the top of the hill, down to Route 27 on the other side, was a principal source of sand and gravel. And even when I was growing up, having a source of sand and gravel was an important thing for just a family to have to build a sandbox or put on the ice. But in colonial days, having a good supply of gravel and sand and gravel was a big thing, and that was one of Wayland's major sources of that. And the other word, pound, the West Siders were objecting to the fact that the town pound, which I think then must have been near the end of Gleason Lane. I'm not really sure where it was, but that was another loss that the West Siders felt they could persuade the general court. But it's a delightful document, and as John points out, the great fun to know where that 600 pounds went. Having just read George Washington's expense account for the Revolutionary War, we really deserve an answer to that. That the big people should take a lesson.
The problem is we don't know whether it was soft money or hard money.
Actually, the general clerk sent 3 distinguished members, I forget who they were, one was probably from Framingham, to Sudbury. They spent several days here, spending that 600 pounds, and met with the selectmen, met with townspeople, so they really did their business. They came out and did it, and much to their credit.
It's interesting to note about the importance of gravel that in past years, when you had to do work on the roads, they would have a town lottery. And the guy that got the proper number, I forget what was the lowest or the highest, the first winner, he only had to fix the piece of the road next to Sand Hill. And the poor fellow that got the bottom number, I mean, he had to go to Peak Plain somewhere. So it was a huge piece of the infrastructure.
Well, they were raising the causeways continuously. The first causeways must have been very primitive, and as the year went by and the floods got higher and higher, more and more gravel was required, particularly on the Route 27 causeway, which was the principal road through town at that time. So that it was no small item, and something worth fighting over.
It's interesting to note that they all went to a bridge, which originally was a ferry. It wasn't a bridge, it was a ferry. And ultimately was replaced with the Stone Axe Bridge, which we're familiar with, which, believe it or not, is, I think, the 3rd oldest Stone Axe Bridge in the Commonwealth. Kind of a fun thing.
It's a beautiful bridge.
But it's a long causeway.
So what's emerging from this is the fact that there's more to this division than have been counted upon, and of course those items are on the west side. So it was easy to get by the Pelham Island issue, but a lot more knotty to take care of the Sand Hill issue, particularly since it was Wheeler territory. For quite a number of town meetings after that when nothing happened.
Well, they keep you all know something. If you enjoy politics and if you enjoy town meeting politics, you get a kick out of this because you just know what's going on. There was one on the 22nd of May. Now, what's happening here? You will notice that the west side is starting to put more and more items on the table. This is called drag it out and make it work. And on 22 May, the town, see if the town will vote to choose a committee to agree and come to a settlement with East Sudbury relating to the division of all donations, gifts, lands, and whatever else formerly belonged to the town of Sudbury. But it's now to be divided between each of said towns by act of the Great General Court. And they go on more than that. They then, on 7th July, added donations to the poor to be divided. and now you're in 13 October, to see if you'll agree on a division agreed to be divided between the towns, not acted upon. You just know where this is going. And it's absolutely incredible to me. And they had another one and they did the same thing.
Well,
No action.
some of you got a notice of this meeting that said, it has its subtitle for the title of the meeting, that said, what really happened? Well, that question is posed because essentially nobody knows what kind of backroom bickering went on to finally reach a compromise. But what I think was happening is that, remember that first vote 2 or 3 years earlier was affirmative in the very first round, and it wasn't just because the meeting was in East Sudbury. I think there was already a feeling that the town was too big, and it was probably the sensible thing. You already had a town center now forming here, you had a church, and all those kinds of businesses. You had a mill down on Hop Brook. So this west side was looking and feeling more like a town, and the same thing was happening on the east side. So there must have been men, maybe all East Siders, who were traveling to Boston, talking to their representative, Sudbury regularly appointed, voted for, a representative in the General Court. They must have been meeting in Cambridge at this time. And a lot of lobbying and persuasion must have been going on, because suddenly, right out of the blue, the General Court takes up the petition that's now been languishing for 12, 16 months and passes it. And it's chapter 34 of the general laws, and it goes into great detail. Not only the town will be divided, the use of the river, and here will be the boundary line, and meets and bounds all the way around the future separation of the two communities. So what happened in between time?
Well, what happened in between time is some obvious things. The first was that I can't imagine how it happened that the Wheelers farms were excluded from the land demands of the people on the east. I can't understand, of course, how it was that in the intervening period the town built 2 roads at town expense into the Wheeler farm. And this is true. And I don't think this had anything to do with the fact that Wheeler also ran a tavern down where Aubrey Gordon used to live, where Old County Road now comes out on what is now Route 20. It was somebody else owned it, but he ran it. And you can just see this process going on. Before they got through, they were down to wrestling nuts and bolts about selling the town's weights and measures in the old bell and splitting the amount taken in equally between the two sides. They appointed a committee of assessors to go down and assess the quantities of beef being held by the towns and splitting that up on a sale field with things. In other words, I was kidding my friend George. I said, you know, when I look at the way this list of demands from the west side comes in, all I can think of is that Mr. Wheeler would have made a terrific divorce lawyer. He's got all the instinct. But I think we come to the end, and I think this is appropriate too. Well, on the 19th of October, do you want to go into that further?
No, you can move it.
On the 19th, oh, incidentally, the town of Sudbury also got the training field out of it. But that is the west side. On the 19th of October, in the year 1791, we had a place called Yorktown. The British military band played The World Upside Down. And Cornwallis surrendered to Washington. And on that same day, unaware of what was happening, I like to think that Mr. Wheeler surrendered to the east side, and the agreement was finally agreed upon. Same day.
Well, there were a lot of other things that they had to settle. They had quite a bit of ammunition, a lot of powder. Those had to be subdivided. What were some of the other? Guns.
Powder. Who was going to take care of which welfare cases? That was
welfare cases.
That was a huge one.
You'd be interested how, not mean-spirited, but not overly generous, towns were about people who came in and had to be supported by the town. Many town meetings had articles on getting rid of Widow Knight. I mean,
and I'm not making it up, her first name was Mary.
So they actually had to divvy up the poor. Who was going to take care of the poor thenceforward? Furthermore, they had to make some settlements about the causeways and the bridges, that the two towns were going to share the cost of repairing and raising the causeway. And in the case of Sherman's Bridge, that was not a problem because the boundary ran right under the middle of the bridge. So Sudbury had its side that fixed up the Wayland had its side. But, and you notice that's how we paid for the beautiful wooden bridge we have there now. But when it came to the big causeway and the two bridges on that, on Route 27, Sudbury, in the law, has to provide a lot of cash to repair that causeway, and that caused some hard feelings on the west side.
You like to talk about the welfare cases, and it reminds me of what is my favorite committee in the entire history of Sudbury. It's called the Committee to Keep Watertown from Coming Too Near. Now, the duty of the committee was to go out on the highways and the byways that connected the town to other towns and be sure that no disreputable welfare cases were crossing over. But the committee had an end that only Al Cap could have dreamed of. Because what happened was the chairman of the committee one day went down and lo and behold, this vision of beauty came sashaying across the river. And instead of warning her out of town, he took up with her. And the committee was dissolved, never to be recreated.
When you read in the town report that one of the selectmen was paid so many shillings and pence for perambulating the bounds of Sudbury and Watertown, you're talking about the boundary between Wayland and Weston. Because the westerly boundary of Watertown for a very long period of time was the Western Wayland boundary. And here's another example. Many people think this was a great event for a town that split into two, but as Ellen Emery points out repeatedly, that it was very commonplace. Towns were just too big. Dedham, which started about where Dedham Center is today, extended to Rhode Island. And the early grant to Watertown extended to the Pacific Ocean. It was not unusual. Many towns. As a matter of fact, just the reverse happened somewhat later. We began to nibble little bits out of towns and create new towns. I had never heard about the case of Sudbury being united with Marlborough and Hudson in that area. But many of you know that Maynard, tiny little Maynard, was created out of a bit of Stowe, a good chunk of Sudbury, and who else? Maybe another town. But so they were doing the reverse, so to speak, creating a new town out of pieces of the old.
Well, we had, of course, Sudbury had in 1701 yielded Framingham. That was part of Sudbury at one point. Matter of fact, the southern border of Sudbury at that point was on the maps called Indian Land. That's now Ashland, but that's where the Indians were. And of course, slightly before that, near the end of the 1600s, 1800s, the town of Marlborough came out of Sudbury. So Sudbury at one point, and even at the time of the Revolution, was a huge piece of territory. But at one point, it was one of the largest towns in Middlesex County. It's huge.
You Wayland folk here this afternoon would be interested to know that in that famous decision to permit the West Siders to have their own parish and build their own church, the General Court, looking around at the general geography of the area, thought that the present location of the town of the North Cemetery, where a big ceremony took place only a couple of hours ago today, was eccentric to the center of gravity of the community. And so they said, you're going to have to move the town center. The meeting house and what little surrounded it, about a mile further south, so that you will be more central to the parishioners who attend the church than at the North Cemetery. And so they did indeed. This is, I understand, the third?
First?
Second. This is the second church, which was built in the North Cemetery. Wonderful. Can we borrow this? In any event, tear the meeting house, the third meeting house down, take it downtown Wayland, where downtown Wayland is today, and sort of reestablish a new community. But attached to that was quite a bit of land in the southern part of Wayland that had not been legally granted to Sudbury. It was territory that had been more or less deeded to the Indian town that John Eliot helped us to form it and to work with. And these men and women who came from there were known as native farmers, and they're the same as the Framingham people that John was just talking about. And so the native farmers were assigned to the town of Wayland, to East Sudbury, to Sudbury. And that is the area of Wayland currently known as Cochituate. And virtually all of Cochituate, extending well towards Wayland Center, was attached to Wayland as sort of a saw for having granted this side of the river their parish and their church. A very interesting bit of political geography that's going on at that time.
I think it's interesting to note that since all of this took place, in relative degrees, except on football day, of civility exists between the two towns. Occasionally it doesn't, he mentioned perambulating the bounds. One of the guys that served on the Board of Selectmen with me was Bill Toomey, some of you may remember him. And Bill worked for one of the federal drug and tobacco places, and he was very law and oriented. We started going over through where the Wayland dump bounds the town of Sudbury, and with the Wayland Selectmen, and lo and behold, the dump trash was 10 yards over on the Sudbury side. So without cracking a smile, Bill Toomey turned around to the Wayland Selectmen, and you have the right to remain silent. Occasionally I get shot again. But actually we have had a marvelous time perambulating the bounds. We're required to do this every X years. And we had a lot of fun. We met the folks from Wayland and so forth for breakfast at the Wayside Inn. Let's do this right. And it's on the house. And we went around, and then we let the guys from Concord pay at the Concord Country Club. It was really just, it was a fun thing. And we also had some interesting togetherness about our common problem, the river. One of the great acts that we did between the two towns was when somebody upstream decided they were going to raise a dam 32 inches at Bell River. What happened as a result of that was that it backflooded 10,000 acres in the river, because it's only a drop of something like 23 inches at 32 miles in the Sudbury River, which is a very odd river. It flows north. There's a lot of strange things about it. But it flooded everything. Well, Wayland had a very famous activist over there, David Lee Childs, who was very active in the Civil War rhetoric, and he was the husband of Lydia Maria Childs, if that helps you. And they went forth and organized together the two towns in an enormous pressure group. It marched on the Great and General Court. Now, when I say I love the Sudbury character, it comes out. I was lucky enough to get the committee minutes of the legislative committee that was dealing with this. And it seems that the people from Sudbury and Wayland started throwing buckets of water over the balcony on the representatives and saying, "How do you like being flooded?" It helped me, really did. The other time that I can think of that was really great was when I was on the Board of Selectmen here, we had a huge problem with are they going to put the high tension lines through the Sudbury River? And never did the towns work so closely together as they did in winning that battle. And it took a lot of doing and a lot of perseverance. It couldn't have been done alone. There is no way it could have been done alone. So I want to say again, thanks to Wayland. Of course, I've got to end this bit of togetherness by saying sometimes we have joint committee. Now let me tell you, this can be difficult. When you get to be a little more elderly, as I was getting at the time, I don't worry about what your obituary is going to look like. And I was trying to figure out what I could do in the obituary with the Joint Sudbury Wayland Septic Sludge Committee. It just was too much. We met at a park bench back at the town hall over here. And I wanted to put a bronze plaque on that bench, but my other selectmen thought that was too extravagant.
It was a great event. Everyone in this room benefits from that. While we're up here, I think we should perambulate this number right here. And I think we can get on, I don't want to get into the public view here, but this is the west side of Wayland. Oh, we've got our laser beam. I mean, this blank area over here is Sudbury.
Yes, this man.
I want to get you oriented, first of all. This is Route 27. It's just crossed the four-arch bridge that John talked about, and it's headed across the long causeway, going up the hill to Sudbury Center. And this cluster of three black dots here are the three homes, two homes and a tavern, that were located where River Road, which comes down here, meets Water Row. And Water Row extends northwestward in this direction. And this, incidentally, is the Sudbury River here. And this is one of the taverns which was on the main road from Springfield to Boston, the Boston Post Road, because this was the Boston Post Road until 1820 or so. And this is the Wayland landfill, and this is the Sudbury landfill. And in addition, I should have put the septic facility on. I think it's right in here somewhere.
That, of course, is Mr. Wheeler's farm.
And this boundary line here turns out to be, this is Mr. Wheeler's farm, which was the big thorn in the issue. And this little tiny triangle here is the Sudbury training field, and it still belongs to Sudbury. When I asked the town surveyor the other day, who owned that piece of land, he said, I'm not sure. Anyway, let's see.
Note the roadway into the Wheeler farm.
That's this little here.
Now, if you don't think that wasn't a political compromise, I don't know what is.
This is the Longfellow Tennis Club. And let's see, this is the paint lady who's on the sharp bend on Old County Road, or River Road as it is in Wayland. But look what happens. the boundary comes down the river, as they thought originally was a good idea, and which John said a physical boundary makes a good boundary, to a point here. There is indeed in the river a marker, and the boundary line comes across and crosses Route 27. There's a big sign entering on that, you know that. Then the line comes down on the west side of Water Road, and the bound here, south of water, very difficult to perambulate. The boundary line that comes around here, because I assume this property here was owned by this cluster of homes, which did not want to be incorporated into Sudbury. There was a Goodnoe there, and a Moore, and a Carter with the three family names, and they evidently were east side oriented. They were only a hop, skip, and a jump from the meeting house. Why would they want to move? So then the boundary comes over and rejoins River Road down here, and it runs along the west side of River Road all the way down until you get to the Paint Lady. And on the Paint Lady side of the road is a bound, and then the line backs up and goes back up the road on the other side, the east side of the road, past the DAR monument, which many of you know is this green dot here. Then it stops at around here on the east side of the road, zigs back this way, and then down here. So this is Sudbury, and this is Wayland. And the road belongs to Wayland, which I think east side got a bum deal on this because they have to repair oil that road. Then comes the famous access to the Wheeler Parent. The house comes in here, down in here. And if you're at the Longfellow swimming pool this summer, in the green grassy area next to the pool is a Wayland Sudbury town bound. And you may see a selectman, their selectman, wander in to check that down in swim clothes.
We always used to get the town engineer to do that.
So here comes the boundary line. It goes around. There's nothing left of Mr. Williams' farm. It's been virtually dug away and now recreated. The Sudbury landfill was essentially rebuilt from a very low point where the sand was removed. So we come down over Route 20. There's a mound here that you often see. Then down to the railroad, and then veers back up here, so that you get terrible confusion in here as to who is where. I remember asking the people in Town Line Hardware, "What town are you in?"
The police used to tell us that it was a terror for them if they started chasing somebody down and said, either get them before or call the Wayland police. Don't get them in the middle of it.
That would be no man's land right in here.
Absolutely.
So after that problem was taken care of, then it was shoot for Framingham, and they went down here, across Pelham Island Road, where they left one family in East Sudbury. I don't know the story that goes with that, but one family is still on the east Sudbury side, and then all the rest are old Sudbury boundaries.
These boundary lines occasionally have some practical and head-scratching results. I remember when I was selecting, we had one problem where one of these bizarre lines, some developer had put a house in, and the darn line went right through the middle of the house. And we had a number of meetings between the Sudbury and Wayland assessing what the heck should we do on this one. We finally went and you have to do a good thing and hired a lawyer, and they came up with a decision between the two towns. It depends upon which side of the line the bedroom is on. Nice, I mean, these are family people.
I'll bet that's the Bennett house that's located on Pelham Island Road.
Right, they do.
The line does go through the house, and I know that you have a choice of which town you can go to school.
They both support.
So, I do want to acknowledge very briefly the miscellaneous sources of information, much of which John knew long ago, but which I learned a lot about, starting off with his war years, which was invaluable. Should be in every Sudbury school classroom. And as I've mentioned Helen Emery 3 or 4 times. Helen has an entire chapter on the separation. I believe it's called The Separation. Wonderful, typical Helen Emery, extraordinary research, digging in every possible archive, museum, and source that you could imagine, with loads and loads of wonderful quotes. And as I was working on this, I discovered in my file a wonderful 2-part series written for the Sudbury Town Crier in 1975 by Barbara Robinson, who's sitting up in the back of the room. So raise your hand. You may have forgotten that you wrote it. But the headline of the article is, "What was Sudbury like in 1775?" So when I was trying to learn the kinds of human problems that Sudbury has just before the separation, it was a gold mine. So I want to acknowledge that while we're here.
I'd like to add a little bit about this book. First of all, the people who really did the hard work in it were the town clerk's office. My wife was the town clerk then, and I know how hard she worked at this. And she and Barbara Stevens at that time was her assistant. They did just enormous work on this. I was fortunate to be able to edit it, but it was also something we did as a town as a bicentennial project. And when we were through, we left the town a large number of these volumes that they could sell as people came in and asked for it. It's my understanding that those have all disappeared since.
No, Historical Commission has 2 cartons of them.
You got 2 cartons? Excellent. Good place to know.
There's more.
Because it was a very hard thing to do, and they are. It's just you'll enjoy it if you read it as a novel and imagine the characters. You can't beat it.
Questions?
So, I'm not sure.
Two other things. Of course, everybody knows about Hudson's history. There is a mysterious history which can only be found with great sleuthing. And I didn't want to do this to the people in the library, but there was a fellow named Thomas Stearns that started writing a history in the early 1800s. And there's a long story about that, but that was one of the earlier documents. There was a marvelous little book put out by the Works Progress Administration in the 30s on Sudbury.
Was that reprinted at one point?
And I know about this one because, there you go. I know about this one because the editor of the first one was my father, who did much to get me interested in all this sort of thing.
This one's twice as thick. 1639 to 1939, Sudbury, Massachusetts. It's beautifully done. It has wonderful illustrations in it. You'll recognize.
They had a good team of state and county researchers working on that at the time. It wasn't just local people, so it's an excellent little synopsis.
The Wayland Historical Society has printed up quite a large number of copies of Chapter 34, which is the act that created East Sudbury. And there are some copies right down here. Come up and help yourself. It's kind of fun to read because it has that old archaic language in it. And it spells out all those details of who gets what and where the boundary lines are. It's kind of fun to read. And I brought in one copy, and it's over on the piano of that's the petition from the East Sudbury people that they sent to the general court, which did the business. Forget the town meetings. They weren't successful, so they went right to the general court. It was written, I think, by Joseph Curtis and signed by 122 men from the east side. And it evidently was very effective. And again, the language is just so marvelous. You can't imagine people talking like that. But that's how people wrote legal documents in those days. So
decided where the name of Sudbury would be, who would get it? East or west?
It never was in question. From day one, even the people on the east side are the ones that came up with the east side. I think they knew that if they ever wanted to be the parent town, they'd have a revolution on their hands. That's simple. And they never did it. I believe George was Wayland, but Wayland just
We aren't finished yet. Please take a seat.
Let me just read you one sentence from Helen Emery. She said, "It is clear that the East Siders were extremely eager to disassociate themselves from the West Side." And she goes on to tell what they lost, but they did lose some of the things they wanted. They knew they were going to be the smaller town, but now they wanted to go it alone. The name Wayland is still unknown exactly what went on. Maybe that's the meeting someday in the future that you could then subtitle what really went on. But it's commonly thought that at least one person, a distinguished Wayland resident, was close friends with Francis Wayland, who was president of Brown University. And several townspeople in downtown Wayland had been to Brown, including a pastor at the Unitarian Church. And so it is thought that between 1780 and 1830, that 50-year period of time, there must have been some dissatisfaction with the name Sudbury. So there was a movement afoot, and it didn't take an act of the General Court, I don't think, to change the name. And it was proposed to name East Sudbury Wayland. And I guess it passed in the affirmative.
Part of miscellaneous information, you may be interested to know that there are some old fife and drum group songs, one of which is called Old Sudbury, and the other one of which is called East Sudbury, which is kind of interesting.
I expect drums and fifers to enter the back.
If we have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
I just have a comment. There's a very good early social history called Puritan Village by Sumner Carroll. And it's about the early settlers, and it tells about the language here, and it's wonderful.
You've got a new history coming out.
She's speaking of Sumner Chilton Powell's book, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1968. Yes, that's still available at Toastmasters. You want to explain the maps on this side, please?
Yeah,
on the east side.
It'd be good for coming up and looking at.
This map I thought was interesting because it's dated 1830, which is not all that long after all of this happened. And you will see again the arrangements. This was done by a fellow named Wood. It comes from the state archives, and it shows a number of things that you might be interested in. It had nothing to do with Sudbury and Wayland, although they do show all of that and where the river is. But I noticed, for example, that they got a monument called the Wadsworth Monument. Now, I had always understood that all they had before they put the monument up in 1876 was a cairn of stones. But down it, there isn't a little drawing of a monument there. So we're finished, and it's interesting. But it's the closest thing I could find in the maps I had available that showed where that line was after a couple of years, because we know there were no changes.
It's labeled the Wheeler Farm.
Absolutely. Clearly.
The beauty of the 1830 map, every town in Massachusetts had to make a draw map with certain rules and regulations in 1794. And then again in 1830. The Wayland map was done by William Grout of the Grout Herd House. And he failed, or was not ordered to put the name of every resident on the houses. But William Wood, who did the Sudbury map, not only put the house on there and all the other things, mills and meeting house, and everything, but he put the name of the family. Sometimes both names, I mean the first and second name, which is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful system, particularly for the 1830 period when so few other data. Now But in Wayland, we just get the streets, but we don't get any family names on it. So you're one up on us.
Any other questions?
If I heard you correctly, as far back as 1708, have you heard? As far back as 1708, there were problems with flooding between the two towns, and that started a lot of the problems. I would suspect, and you might know more, that the flooding was there before. And I wonder, in terms of logic, why the settlers settled in a flooded area. That was ultimately because they were wise enough, I think, to know the disadvantages, even in those days, of floods and not floods. I was wondering if perhaps there were farming practices going on that occurred in the years before there, which in fact cut down a lot of trees and perhaps caused the flooding as we know it is experienced in other parts of the world now.
I think the history down there indicates that the reason they settled where they did was that the major asset was the river. Remember, you could get on that river and go for miles in either direction. It gave you a great deal of water. It also, over the years, by flooding and receding, had created very rich soil in the farmlands next to it. The river grasses themselves were extraordinary. One observer said they grew as high as a man on horseback. And they used to harvest. The quality of the hay was extraordinary. The nature of the pipes, as they call them, was such that it was excellent for making straw products later on. You've got to remember at that time there was salmon running in the river. So it was a gold mine in terms of where they sat. And that's the reason they went down there. It just made plain darn good sense, because these were farmers and this was manna from heaven. It was later on it began to flood more and more. That was an episode that took place in the 1800s when they started fooling around with dam upstream. But the river was always a problem. You read in the old minister's notebooks, a terrible season for coughs and colds which carried many out of time into eternity. And 7 lay dead on the east side of the river and 12 on the west. You know, you get some sense of how tough this was. And people literally were losing their lives trying to cross that place in the river. It was you take the good with the bad, folks, when you deal with Mother Nature.
Any other questions? Yes.
So I want to make a comment about the settlement at where River Road goes in Old County Road. What happened that settlement never developed? Was it flooding? That's where the boundary of Sudbury and Wayland, just south on Route 27, where the Wallbacks live now, and the old rice land. There was a center there is a center there yet. It has some very old homes. And there's also a tavern there up on the hill, an old tavern built in the early 1700s. And this never apparently, it looked like it should be a town center, but apparently it never developed.
Well, I think a little bit of a village formed there, because it was a point where two major roads diverted. One went to Berlin, went to Sudbury Center, and then on to the west, and the other went to Worcester and Springfield. So it was the kind of place, a good location for business, but nothing came of it.
Well, you're talking now about Water Road, in that area?
Yeah.
Okay. You're talking about my favorite tavern used to be down there. Source of many great stories. And of course, the stagecoaches came down there and went, took a little jive and went past where the Haynes Garrison House was. And and went up over Goodman Hill and off to Lancaster and so forth. The man put his tavern there, the old Moore Tavern, we used to call it when we were kids, which was a big building. It was about the same dimensions as the original building of the Wayside Inn. So it was a big one, and it became a hangout for criminals and murderers of all sorts, and got a very black reputation. But it was a logical place to be. You had a garrison house there for protection. Of course, that's where the great Battle of the Garrison House took place. But it's a normal confluence. It was a great spot to rest your stagecoach, and there's business in that. So it made sense, but it was never the town center. I think they just wanted to be closer to the river.
Well,
Any other questions?
it's a wonderful crowd. I think both John and I are not necessarily surprised, but thrilled at this turnout. 6 o'clock this morning, I didn't think we'd have anyone here. We have one last question up there.
2 parts. One, what was the denomination called when they split the parish? And what was the congregational, or what was it? And secondly, where were the schools before and after?
Both sides. Schools were on both sides of the river. The denomination did not change. It was, I'm not an expert on the clergy, but it was...
The two churches were exactly the same.
Same
I would call
denomination.
them, if I had to put a word on it, I'd call them congregation.
Yeah, that's close enough.
I believe there were as many as 11 schoolhouses in 1780. It was common to build little schoolhouses all over the place. And one of the things that every single town meeting that's in John's book is a discussion about building a schoolhouse. I don't think they ever got it built, but it appears that they turned it down. But it's just wonderful that the Congregational Church down in South Sudbury is, of course, a parent or whatever, a relative of this church, which is a relative of the church in East Sudbury. So there's a quite family lineage there.
It's also fun to note that the West Side finally got its pound. Mr. Wheeler was on the committee. Pound's over here on the land of his nephew. If that helps.
And it's a lovely town.
Thank you, George and John.